What about the 700 Americans that are dead? Should they not be happy?
My good friend Joe, and he is a good friend, he's received contributions from 44 billionaires. Pete, on the other hand, is trailing, Pete. You only got 39 billionaires contributing. So, Pete, we look forward to you. I know you're an energetic guy and a competitive guy to see if you can take on Joe on that issue. But what...
War is an easy thing to talk about. There are not many people of the generation that remember it. The right honourable gentleman served with distinction in the last war. I never killed anyone, but I wore uniform. But I was in London in the Blitz in 1940, living in the Millbank Tower where I was born. Some different ideas have come in since. And every night I went down to the shelter in Thames House. Every morning I saw Dockland burning. 500 people were killed in Westminster one night by a landmine. It was terrifying. Aren't Arabs terrified? Aren't Iraqis terrified? Don't Arab and Iraqi women weep when their children die? Doesn't bombing strengthen their determination? What fools we are to live in a generation for which war is a computer game for our children and just an interesting little Channel 4 news item. Every member of Parliament tonight who votes for the government motion will be consciously and deliberately accepting the responsibility for the deaths of innocent people if the war begins, as I fear it will. Now, that's for their decision to take. But this is a quite unique debate in my parliamentary experience where we're asked to share responsibility for a decision we won't really be taking, with consequences for people who have no part to play in the brutality of the regime which we are dealing with. And I finish with this. On October the 24th, 1945, and the former Prime Minister from Bexley Old Sidcup will remember it, the United Nations Charter was passed. And the words of that charter etched into my mind and move me even as I think of them. We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save future generations, succeeding generations, from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has caused untold suffering to mankind. That was the pledge of that generation to this generation, and it would be the greatest betrayal of all if we voted to abandon the Charter and take unilateral action and pretend we were doing it in the name of the international community. And I shall vote against the motion for the reasons that I've given the House.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. Happy New Year. Welcome to 2020. We're broadcasting live from Brooklyn, USA, where we say no war with Iran, with super producer Matt Leck.
Yo.
Chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
And a whole bunch of guests tonight. This is a quad header. We've got Derek Davison of the indispensable foreign exchange Substack. Brilliant and very important foreign policy analyst. We're going to be starting with him in a couple of minutes talking about the crisis, the catastrophe, the escalation against Iran and the regional dynamics of it. Then the great Meagan Day is joining us to explain why, if you haven't been made, this is something you're going to need to send out to your family and friends. Bernie Sanders is the one to beat Donald Trump. So if you are actually serious about getting this grotesque, bloated thing out of office in 2020, you got to get serious about supporting Bernie Sanders. Then the great Ben Burgess, he's in studio. He's got his debunk gear on, which is a Red Wings shirt. And he is going to be talking about the relationship between rhetoric and propaganda, with some visits from Christopher Hitchens and Jordan Peterson. And we're also going to be, of course, talking about the crisis escalated by Donald Trump, which is consuming all of our minds. Then Lauren Ashcroft, she's running for Congress, and she's here in studio talking about why she's running, the fight for single payer, why she supports Bernie Sanders, how her campaign fits into a larger struggle, her thoughts on how she would respond to U.S. belligerence and U.S. empire in the Middle East if she was in Congress. And then she's going to begin a little bit, she's going to stay for some of the post game, where we're going to talk about Joe Biden, who on a subconscious level must be trying to show us that he will really lose to Donald Trump. And I say this as somebody who thinks that this, and has always thought from the beginning, that this is a race between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, that Joe Biden is much more formidable than a lot of people on the left want to acknowledge. He's pretty popular. But when you go out and you start doing learn how to code shit, nope, you're going to lose. And it's going to be a gift wrap for the clown fascist in the White House, and of course a whole bunch more on the post game, including relaxing a little bit by making fun of Ben Shapiro. Following Joe Biden challenging him to a push-up contest. All that and much, much more. It's great to be back. It's a very accelerated time. I mean, Australia is literally burning. What's happening in Iran is incredibly bad, and it could be ultimately catastrophic. Then, on the other hand, there's some other pieces of momentum, which I actually am going to spend a couple of minutes. We're off format. So as an example, in the post game, we're going to talk a little bit about Haiti's independence and celebrate that. We have a great clip from CLR James and Stuart Hall, but we're going to do a little commentary and then get right to Derek Davison because of all that's taking place. But I just wanted to start by saying, look, 2020 is here, and it is time to look at the big picture and get incredibly serious. Now, first and foremost, obviously, the number one task in the United States is making Bernie Sanders the nominee of the Democratic Party, then electing him president of the United States. This is an urgent, bare necessity task. A lot of work has been put into making the moment we're in possible. Here's a fact. We have the people. We can organize them to confront decades of neoliberal hegemony and the hopelessness that is instilled in our very core by what Mark Fisher accurately called capitalist realism. This will require building a movement, not a subculture, a movement that can bring people together from all across the country, from different backgrounds, different social practices, different ideas, beliefs, and attitudes, formed on a basis of solidarity with a real policy agenda. If democratic socialism isn't about building a mass movement and all the complexity that it entails, it's not going to achieve anything except a new section of rhetoric in our politics. And ultimately, rhetoric is only useful insofar as it is facilitating and amplifying real outcomes, from changing attitudes, building organization, and then, of course, ultimately, most importantly, delivering material gains. This is also happening globally. The world is rising up. Haiti, Ecuador, Chile, protesters continue to fight against neoliberalism, pushing to rewrite the Constitution under ruthless police suppression. In Bolivia, the coup government is meeting incredible organization and popular resistance. Vijay Prashad and I talked about the enormous bubbling up of resistance to the neo-fascism and Hindutva of the Modi government. In Brazil, a judicial coup blocked President Lula from running and almost certainly winning election. But due to investigative reporting and international mobilization, he is out of jail and leading in response to the disastrous Bolsonaro regime. In France, strikes, people are on the street fighting with every fiber they have against the failed neoliberal nightmare of the Macron government. We have a big fight ahead, and victory is far from guaranteed. But there are cracks, even in this disaster in the Middle East. Of course, this warmongering by the Trump regime could undermine this incredible crack that we actually do see in cross-sectarian, class-based organizing, which we're seeing particularly in Lebanon. It's there. It's emerged in Sudan. It's emerged across the globe. It's emerged in teachers' strikes and other strikes in the United States. And of course, in the U.S. context, first and foremost, in the Bernie Sanders campaign. We need to build and show solidarity abroad. But one of the most powerful things we can do is win this election for Bernie and have an actual humane presence willing to fight at the heart of empire. We need to learn to hit back hard against information, but not get bogged down in paying attention to pundits and other mediocrities. Our energy is best spent engaging with people directly. That strategy has to be worked, and it will be the only strategy that wins, because the anti-Bernie mood in the media will only grow and get more and more ridiculous as the campaign grows. That's why shows like this and all sorts of independent and alternative networks are incredibly important. But you've also got to be talking to your friends and family, making this real. This is exactly the time to aim to grow, not close in. Breaking through capitalist realism requires us all to end an individualism and atomization that has been forced on us. And again, it's not about building a subculture. It's about building a movement that allows us to come together as we are into something greater, a movement for people, no matter who they are, where they come from, that's unified on collective principles of basic dignity, goodness for all, not me, us. It's incredibly important, guys. And you see the freak out, you see the pushback, and that's because the gains are coming. And also we know that, look, I mean, what Bernie Sanders is proposing is the absolute bare minimum to viability, frankly, for the species. So, and increasingly, we have to go to Derek Davison. I would be totally honest if I saw polling that indicated Bernie Sanders would be a heavy lift to win a general election. I would still make the case that he is the best candidate. But I would absolutely acknowledge that, because unlike apparently people who seem to have nothing else to talk about than the importance of beating Trump, even though I have many other things to discuss and deliver to you in terms of content, I actually agree with that. It's fundamentally absolutely essential that Donald Trump be defeated. And between the $35 million raised in this last quarter, the millions of people organizing and doing real things, the head-to-head numbers where Biden and Sanders are always polling best, including in geographically vital states, we cannot pretend and allow other people to continue to pretend that Bernie is not only obviously the choice if you have a progressive policy commitment, but this is increasingly the most responsible course of action to take if you actually take seriously that we need to defeat Donald Trump, which we all do. The guy can continue providing amusing content for us from jail or wherever. That would be fine with me, but he needs to not be president. All right, we're going to take a brief break and we'll come back with Derek Davison. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Off normal blocks here, but dealing with, the emergency of what's happening in Iran and the Middle East due to the assassination of General Soleimani. Joining us to do that, no one better that I could think of, Derek Davison. He is a foreign policy analyst. He also is the proprietor of the Foreign Exchanges newsletter, which you can subscribe to through Substack. I'd really recommend you do it. It's an excellent newsletter on history, on foreign policy, covering every part of the globe, with a really, really wide-ranging analysis and independence of thought and anti-imperial, anti-colonial perspective. Derek, thanks so much for being here.
Sure, happy to do it.
So who was General Soleimani?
So Qasem Soleimani was, like most high-ranking officers in the Iranian military these days, he got his start during the Iran-Iraq War, which followed almost immediately on the heels of the Iranian Revolution in 1979. His first action involved with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and specifically with the unit that became the Quds Force, involved infiltrating northern Iraq to cultivate relationships with Kurdish groups who were opposed to Saddam Hussein, and thereby, create a sort of internal force that could, cause trouble for the Iraqi government. He worked for. He was, involved at a high level in the Quds Force. From throughout the 80s into the 90s in places like Lebanon and Iraq, was promoted to commander of the Quds Force. It's not entirely clear exactly when, but it was sometime either late 1997 or early 1998. And his first big sort of charge as the head of the Quds Force, and the way in which he became, sort of known to the U.S. Was his involvement with Shia militias in Iraq that formed in the wake of the U.S. invasion in 2003. Training, Quds Force was involved in training them, in logistics support, in supplying them with weapons. And Soleimani was intimately sort of involved in that process. He's also been involved almost, over the entire sweep of his career. He's been involved in the creation and sort of support of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. He's been the main Iranian representative to Syria in terms of supporting the government of Bashar al-Assad. Quds Force has supported the Houthis in Yemen to some degree. Basically, I mean, he's sort of the international face of the Iranian military and to some degree the Iranian government, period. He's, Quds Force is a sort of special operations force. It does most of the foreign work that the Iranian military gets up to, and it operates largely like a special forces unit. It gets involved in sort of developing proxies, training them, occasionally carrying out direct action, but usually operating through these local groups that are connected to the Quds Force and kind of assisted by the Quds Force.
So we're going to play a clip now, which might seem, I mean, look, I'm not going to lie. I guess on some level it's a certain just kind of like twisted comic relief. But there's a couple of things in this content that actually raises some very serious questions. So one is the extent to which, everybody from Elizabeth Warren to any number of, and Joe Biden, obviously, and Pete Buttigieg, and any number of, Democratic pundits and MSNBC is essentially co-signing on this assassination, but just saying like, there should have been a thoughtful Instagram video that went along with it, or, something like that. And then also this other very this point that we really need to make, and we'll come back to, that, and because we also just recorded an illicit history that will be released for patrons on Sunday, but that, look, we don't want anybody doing this sort of thing. I don't want a global politics or a Middle Eastern politics that is defined by proxy wars and, and lack of respect for sovereignty, and civilians are caught in the crosshairs of hegemonic and imperial ambitions and of the United States and all the rest, right? And so it's not like oh yes, this was great, right? Like the Quds Force, they're like, they're a nice little humanitarian project. On the other hand, the reality is like, yeah, this guy was a general. So I don't know what that, like, yes, they're fighting a proxy war with the United States. What like this melodramatic, childish, like, he hurt Americans. I don't want Americans to be hurt. I don't want anybody to be hurt.
Right.
But what? Like, yeah, he was a general fighting a proxy war. I don't know. Like, there are adults who have serious foreign policy and political jobs who, in addition, they're not peace and love and tie-dye types, because they have no problem with any number of bombs we unleash on other people, but they apparently live in some type of like gnome world where, other people that come up against us with their own foreign policy, I guess they're supposed to come at us with super soakers while we drone them.
Right. Yeah, they're bad guys. They're the villains of the story, because
Right.
the Americans, the United States has to be the protagonist of everything that happens in the world. So anybody who opposes the United States must therefore be the villain.
So this is sound I want you to react to. I'm sorry I got on that tangent. It's just I'm amazed at the childishness of people in response to this. But this is from September 2015. Hugh Hewitt, another person who should never have been allowed to read the foreign section of a newspaper, and a candidate, Donald Trump. And there is something here that I think kind of distills everything.
If this is what I think it's going to be, it's remarkable.
It's
yes.
remarkable. We're going to play a little bit of this.
Are you familiar with General Soleimani?
Yes. Go ahead. Give me a little. Go ahead. Tell me.
He runs the Quds forces.
Yes. Okay. Right.
Do you expect
And I
his
think the Kurds,
behavior?
by the way, have been horribly mistreated by us.
No, not the Kurds. The Quds forces, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Quds
Yes.
forces, the bad guys.
Right.
Do you expect his behavior to
I
change
thought
as a
you said
result?
Kurds.
No. Quds.
I'm sorry. I thought you said Kurds, because I think the Kurds have been very poorly treated by us here. Go ahead.
Agreed. So Soleimani runs the Quds forces. Do you expect his behavior is going to change as a result of this deal with Iran?
I
I'm
think
not
that
asking you who's
Iran
on
right
second.
now is in the driver's seat to do whatever they want to do. I think what's happening with Iran is, I think it's one of the, and I covered it very well. I assume you saw the news conference. I think Iran it's one of the great deals ever made for them. I think it's one of the most incompetent contracts I've ever seen. I'm not just talking about defense. I'm not talking about a contract with another country. I've never seen more of a one-sided deal, I think, in my life. Absolutely.
Well, Soleimani is to terrorism sort of what Trump is to real estate. He's many people would say he's the most dangerous man in the world, and he runs the Quds forces, which is their Navy SEAL. Do you think they're going to stop?
The gentleman that was going back and forth with Russia and meeting with Putin, I read something, and that seems to be also where he's at. He's going back and forth, meeting with other countries, et cetera, et cetera.
That's the guy. And so, do you think
not good for us? And what it shows is a total lack of respect. I mean, that the other countries would even be entertaining him, and they're entertaining him big league. Big league.
Big league.
So when you went before the Senate,
I just want to say later in the post game we'll also play the part where Trump gets pissed at you, Hewitt, for asking him gotcha questions, which he defines as asking about specific people in the Middle East, which is awesome. But honestly, okay, Derek, what?
That was like a vaudeville routine, really. I mean,
why don't you tell me? Okay. Yes.
I think you don't know who the Quds Force is. You tell me who they are.
And of course, we don't even gloss over the fact that, of course, this bloated scumbag totally betrayed the Kurds. But how is it that what though that's going on there is that different from most foreign policy discourse about Iran and how we got where we are?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of it's not. It's just sort of dumber, right? I mean, it's sort of, but the discourse has been all day. I mean, since last night, since the story broke, that you can't talk about what's really important here, which is the repercussions of this assassination and what it could mean, without going through like a 5-minute condemnation of Qasem Soleimani and what he did through his career. And it's been amazing to watch, this parade of people on cable news, and to watch most of the presidential candidates that, they can't just talk about what happened here. They have to, preface it with this litany of wrongdoing, to just so everybody knows that they're not like on board with the Iranians. Like they can't be accused of anything.
And I just want to say, like, as an example, whatever else I might think of, Amy Klobuchar, I was not concerned that she was a big supporter of General Soleimani.
Yeah, I don't know. And the thing that kills me is all of these guys. Klobuchar, Biden, Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren. They're going to be accused by Donald Trump of being pro-Iran anyway. And the people for whom that attack is effective are going to believe it no matter how they equivocate on something like this. So it gets them nothing, but it dilutes the message about what a really dumb thing this was to do and risky thing this was to do, and sort of weakens the main point, all in service of nothing, really.
I mean, but I think it's also, the reason I want to emphasize that is because, again, like, look, I looked at Warren's statement, and some people won't like this. I don't think she knew who Soleimani was, right? Like, she's not going to express it at like an idiot like Trump. But the danger with so many of these candidates, obviously led by Joe Biden, who is a pure creature of the foreign policy establishment, this is stuff that they actually think, right? Like I think in some cases, and it's certainly Buttigieg. So I think in some cases, yes, you're dealing with people that just sort of reflexively feel a need to dilute the message and the clarity. But then there's also a lot of Tommy Vitor, of all people, actually put out a tweet kind of saying like, look, you don't need to lead with how bad this guy was. There's other stuff going on here, and Neera Tanden immediately actually there's nothing wrong with him saying that he killed Americans. So and I think that's actually a genuine belief that a lot of these people have, so it's dangerous, not just because it's foolish politics in the face of Trump. It's also like underlining the fact that these candidates will they are either totally part of the foreign policy establishment, or if they're Warren, their first instinct will always be to go to the foreign policy establishment, and then she'll slightly revise it after getting some pushback on Twitter.
Right, and this is how you get a lack of discussion about the things that the United States does in the world, because this is how you get, for example, the criminal lack of debate that we had about the Iraq War, because everybody's response when the Bush administration was clearly running, gearing up to go to war, was first to condemn Saddam Hussein and then go, but maybe we should talk about this. And by the time you get to the but, nobody's paying attention anymore. It's the condemnation is what sticks and what makes it easy to sell the public when, everybody across the political spectrum, or nearly everybody across the political spectrum, is, condemning this person, and it sort of makes it easier to sell that policy.
Right. Now, in terms of what the repercussions of this could actually be, I saw Trita Parsi from Quincy was on with Crystal and Sagar, and I caught some of it. He said one of the things that's very revealing is that the Iranians are not even consulting with the Europeans. They consider the Europeans to be irrelevant. And the reports is that Pompeo was consulting with the Israelis and the Saudis before this happened. Basically the Iranians are going to seek counsel and talk with the Russians and the Chinese. What do you make of that, both in terms of the changing, just the power balances involved, and then secondly, how does that bode for the type of response that they might take?
I think it's connected to the fallout from Trump's decision to abandon the 2015 nuclear deal and sort of wreck that accord. The Iranians have been looking to the Europeans and specifically the UK, France, and Germany to sort of salvage that agreement, and they've been helpless. Whether either because they're not willing to really challenge the United States or they're just not able to challenge the United States, and so I think at this point the feeling in Iran generally, at least in the Iranian political system, is that Europe is superfluous. It's sort of it's an appendage of the United States to some degree, and it's Russia and China that are the actual sort of competing or counterbalancing powers in the world. So I think there are implications about how the Iranians have come to view geopolitics more broadly. The thing, in terms of trying to gauge what the response is going to be, part of the challenge here is that there are so many ways that the Iranians can respond to this. They've got proxies in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, to some degree in Yemen. They've been carrying out there's alleged at least, they've been carrying out their own sort of asymmetric attacks in the Persian Gulf. There was, for example, the missile attack that's still never been attributed against Saudi Arabia a couple of months ago. It was probably Iran or probably involved Iran on some level. And there's so many targets that they could decide to go for. And it's, I think there's no question that there will be a response, but it's hard to know where that's going to come and what form it's going to take.
Right.
I think, we can predict more clearly probably what the reaction is going to be, for example, by the Iraqi government and, what that is likely to mean. This is the second time. Actually, I just saw on Twitter there's reports of another U.S. strike this evening, which would make the third time in, a few days that the United States has treated Iraqi sovereignty as a joke. Right. There are growing calls inside Iraq to end their military agreements with the United States and force the United States to withdraw. I think that's only going to get stronger. Those calls are only going to get stronger. And we have to remember also, in addition to Soleimani, there was a high-ranking Iraqi official, sorry, I'm blanking, Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, who was the deputy chair of the Popular Mobilization Committee, the umbrella organization that oversees Iraq's militia groups, was also killed in that strike. So there's going to be a lot of pressure, I think, and a lot of calls in Baghdad for the United States to leave Iraq.
Well, as obviously there should be. And again, that was actually another thing that was very misreported here. That yes, what was the going into the embassy and the green zone was partially in response to this U.S. airstrike, and that was response to the killing of a contractor. But if you looked at the actual reporting, there was plenty of people there just saying like, yeah, whatever. Like you just need to get out. You can't keep occupying our country. It's not really like a specific crisis we're talking about. We're talking about a project that goes back to 2003, where first you killed a massive amount of civilians in an illegal invasion, and you've occupied it in various forms ever since, with all of the, various diplomatic and economic consequences. And I think obviously some people feel similarly about, Iranian influence as well. Although I think, again, you have to be real that Iran has more organic relationships in Iraq than we do because they're next to each other, right? Like there's actual shared projects. It isn't just like Iran's just like, no, we're in Barbados. That's what we're doing. And we're going to just bomb them periodically.
Exactly.
What do you think? I mean, could China or Russia? I wish Donald Trump was in Putin's pocket at this moment because I don't think Russia wants war with Iran. What could they do to throw their weight behind de-escalating this? Is that possible?
I mean, I would expect. I mean, to be honest, as you say, they don't want a war between the United States and Iran either. I don't think Iran wants that war. The United States doesn't want that war. At least we shouldn't want that war. There are certainly some people in Washington who do want that war, but we shouldn't want that war. I think they'll probably. I mean, if I had to guess, I would say, if the Iranians are listening to the Russians and the Chinese, the Russians and the Chinese will tell them to respond, but don't respond in a way that, to sort of respond in a not necessarily a deniable way, because I don't think there's, any denying what's going on right now. But don't be the party that sort of gets blamed for starting the war. You know what I mean? So don't take an action that is sort of irreversible or that is, sort of incontrovertibly taking things to the next level, but respond kind of in kind. And then, if the United States wants to continue to be the aggressor here, let them.
Do you think inside Iran, there is actually a lot of political diversity inside the Iranian leadership, but I'm assuming that this is something that, including, by the way, people who a couple of days ago were on the streets protesting. I'm assuming the response here is pretty synchronized because this was, you were saying that this is a guy who they do reputable public opinion polling. They don't poll the approval ratings of the supreme leader, but they do pretty much for everybody else. And he consistently was maybe the second most, compared to the supreme leader, admired person in Iran across the board.
Yeah, Soleimani is still very popular. He's maybe had a little bloom come off over the last couple of years as Iranians have gotten tired of foreign, adventures. There's a sense that we've seen in some of the street protests of, why are we spending money in Syria when the economy is falling apart here, that kind of thing. And he may have taken a little bit of a hit for that because he's sort of the public face of these interventions, or was the public face of these interventions. But even at that, in opinion polling, he still regularly, gets approval ratings that are, any politician in the United States would love to have. You're talking about 60 to 70%,
Oh, so that's why
very
Trump did
supportive
it.
and
Trump
that sort of thing.
Now we know why Trump did it.
Yeah, he doesn't like the polls.
Somebody told him a poll number, and he was, can I just say, and I will get in trouble saying this, I'll try to think of how to say this for public, but there is something, look, not saying General Soleimani was a nice man, but this was a very competent, very strategic, very physically courageous general. And we live in a world where some bloated trust fund baby sitting in Mar-a-Lago gets to kill him with a robot. It's just, I don't know. It's like, I don't know. It's like some guy from Long Island's like tripping Michael Jordan.
It is. There is. It's a little incongruous.
It's a little incongruous. Like, could you imagine if you said to Trump, like, hey, man, you're better than this guy. Why don't you follow his schedule for a day? You know, imagine like.
Right.
He's hiking up into the mountains to organize the Kurds, and the first 10 minutes he's just like, I'm the best organizer. No one has done guerrilla proxies better than me. And then 10 minutes later it's like it's like having an asthma
the Kurds
attack.
have been very nasty to me.
Very nasty. He's trying to explain how he stole Robin Givens from Mike Tyson while he's keeling over.
Right. Yeah, it kind of boggles the mind.
In the last
and
couple,
I think
please, go ahead.
The bigger picture here is not about whether you think Soleimani was a bad guy or a good guy or otherwise. It's
such
about
a childish question.
What are we doing? What is the policy here? Like what happens now? What does the Trump administration think is going to happen now? Because what we're in the throes of is a president who doesn't plan these things out and doesn't, understand the situation really, and just sort of acts on impulse, which means, that despite his repeated statements about being anti-war and recognizing what a bad idea the Iraq War was, so he claims anyway, and, he just wants peace with Iran and he doesn't want to escalate things. He's left his Iran policy in the hands of a foreign policy establishment that has been after regime change in Tehran from the moment the Iranian Revolution took hold in 1979. And that's where we are. I mean, these are the people who are cheering this on, really, and Trump is just sort of bounding from mishap to mishap as we get closer to a conflict.
Well, can we also all right, just two things real quick I hope you can hit. There is a weird symmetry between some people who have great left critiques, but for some reason want to take Trump's rhetoric at times at face value on pulling back, and then a foreign policy establishment that, besides his rhetoric, he's doing everything they want. I mean, you go back to, I remember when he first got inaugurated and he went to the CIA and everybody was like, oh my God, that was so weird and it didn't make any sense and all this crap. It doesn't matter. He went behind the scenes with them after he did that whole incoherent speech and he said, you guys can do whatever you want. No restrictions on drones, civilian casualties, whatever. So it's nonsense that Trump does not represent a break in U.S. foreign policy in any type of fundamental sense, certainly with regards to militarism or civilian casualties.
No, and I think, part of it is just he's fundamentally incurious and lazy, and he doesn't care. He doesn't pay attention to this stuff. He doesn't care about this stuff. He doesn't read anything or, learn anything. And, we've seen in the rare cases where he's done things that have not kind of lined up with what his foreign policy team or his national security team wants him to do, like withdrawing from northeastern Syria or, I can't even think of another case, but that's the sort of the main one.
Maybe North Korea.
He's done it. Yeah, maybe North Korea. I mean, but in both of those cases, it's only been because another foreign leader flattered him enough and got him on the phone one-on-one and was able to talk him into doing something else. And that's basically how he is. He bounces from, one person to another, and whoever kind of gets him on the right day gets to make policy, and that's how this administration operates. If it's Recep Tayyip Erdogan convincing him to withdraw from Syria, if it's Kim Jong-un sending him a lovely letter and convincing him to meet with him, it's there's nothing that comes after that. There's no planning for anything. There's no what's the next step.
A lot of people thought
that the effect of that generally, as it was in Syria, is for the foreign policy team then to go into crisis mode and lock him in a room and browbeat him until he agrees to go back on what he said.
A lot of people said that Brad Pitt took Robin Givens from Mike Tyson, but Kim knew that it was me, and it was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Last question for you, just to put in relationship with this. Even as this is happening, Turkey has voted in Parliament to send forces to Libya to prop up the government in Tripoli. Now, there's a warlord in another part of the country which is backed by the Saudis and Egypt, and the United States under Trump has, in fact, shifted its policy. It went from supporting the internationally recognized government in Tripoli to backing this warlord in the other part of the country, along with the Saudis and the Egyptians. I just want you to bring that in relationship with, in the sense of, like, is there anything that is not unraveling here in the region?
I mean, there's Libya is escalating. There was a story just the other day that the southern separatists in Yemen have stopped cooperating with the government again, so that's potentially unraveling. Australia is becoming uninhabitable. Like, right. There's a lot of stuff going on, and none of it seems to be very good. We'll have to see what happens in Libya. I think they've approved the troop transfer, and the effect of that. I mean, the reason that the Libyan government has had to ask for Turkish assistance is because the warlord Khalifa Haftar has been bolstered by Russian mercenaries, and this invasion this attack that he's made on Tripoli that's stalled out for months is suddenly gaining steam because he's got Russian support. So we're going to have Turkey and Russia on opposite sides of another conflict. They're on opposite sides in Syria. At the same time, they're sort of, one-on-one, they're sort of cozying up to one another, and it's a very strange dynamic, but I guess we'll have to see how that shakes out.
All right. Well, we'll be talking with you soon to follow all of this, and vote for Bernie Sanders. Derek Davison, Foreign Exchanges. Everybody should subscribe. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks a lot. All right, folks, we're going to take a really brief break, and then we're going to come back again off format today with another mega guest, Meagan Day. We will be right back. Oh, wait, actually, I should say really quickly, I'll do this much faster than I usually do it, but definitely become a patron, patreon.com/TMBS. We'll talk more on Tuesday about all the extra content. It's how the show happens. Time to join today. Go to tmbs.fm, get your gear, get your merch, buy your tickets to see us February 7th at the Bell House. All right, we'll be right back with Meagan Day. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. It's a pleasure and honor to welcome Meagan Day. She's a writer for Jacobin magazine. She's a member for DSA and an organizer. And she is the co-author with our other buddy, Matt Karp, of Bernie is the One That Can Beat Trump. Here's Why, which is available and everybody should read in Jacobin. Meagan, thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, Meagan, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about this article, but first, I really want to underline how profoundly important and distinct Sanders' response to Iran has been. One part is substantive. In 2017, there was a sanctions package aimed at Iran and Russia. Bernie Sanders is the only member of the Democratic caucus in the Senate and the only person running for president who voted against those sanctions. And those sanctions, that act of economic warfare after the Trump administration tore up the Iran deal, is a major precursor to this escalation. Warren voted for it. Booker voted for it. I believe Gabbard voted for a House version of it. I know how it went in the Senate. And I just want to play really briefly this video we have of Bernie Sanders talking about his history on war and get your response to it. Now, again, for the sort of, some of the sort of wankery out there, yes, Bernie Sanders has cast bad votes. He's made some mistakes. There is no one else in contention for the presidency with this type of clarity or consistency, particularly on Iran. So let's play this, and I'll throw it to you, Meagan.
Recently, I've been criticized a bit because of my opposition to war and my belief that we got to do everything possible to solve international conflict without going to war. So let me be very clear. I make no apologies to anybody.
Love that beat.
That when I was a young man, before I was elected to anything, I opposed the war in Vietnam, and I know what that war did to my generation. And when I was a member of the House, I helped lead the effort against the war in Iraq because I knew that Cheney and Bush and these other folks were lying about weapons of mass destruction.
I'm opposed to giving the president a blank check to launch a unilateral invasion and occupation of Iraq, and why I will vote against this resolution.
And that war and that vote was the worst foreign policy blunder in the modern history of the United States. And as a senator, I'm proud that I helped for the first time in 45 years to utilize the War Powers Act to get the United States out of an unauthorized war in Yemen. Unfortunately, after passing in the House and the Senate, Trump vetoed that legislation. And I'll tell you something, that right now, I'm going to do everything that I can to prevent a war with Iran. Because if you think the war in Iraq was a disaster, my guess is that the war in Iran would be even worse. So let's work together and prevent that war. If people want to criticize me for that, go for it, that's okay. I don't apologize to anybody. Thank you.
And a tight beat. Meagan Day, your thoughts?
Yeah, I love that beat. I was a little surprised that you weren't, when you were like, oh, I love that beat. For a minute, I thought you were playing it over it. And I was like, good job, Michael. That's awesome.
I wish. No, it was Bernie. Bernie selected it.
It's all Bernie.
Yeah.
So yeah, I want to echo something you said earlier, which is that Bernie Sanders truly stands apart among the Democratic presidential primary candidates when it comes to foreign policy in general. And on the question of Iran, like you said, he's the only person who's running who's made it extremely clear that he will do everything within his power to stop the United States from going to war with Iran, and has made it a priority to not contribute to escalating tensions with Iran for precisely that reason. And then I want to talk a little bit about his history as well, because this is not inconsistent with his history. Like you mentioned, it's not a completely uncheckered past. He has a long career as a politician. And so obviously you're going to find some things in there that are somewhat questionable. But my God, I mean, we're comparing completely apples and oranges when it comes to Bernie Sanders versus everybody else who's running for president. And in fact, every other mainstream.
Apples to Domino's Pizza or, something really bad. Yeah.
Really incredible apples to
right.
Domino's Pizza. And, even folks like Warren, who I think many people consider sort of assume that she must be a progressive on foreign policy, really doesn't hold a candle to Bernie Sanders in terms of his record on foreign policy. So we want to start with his opposition to American military intervention in Latin America in the 1980s, and how it's very unusual for a mayor of a small town to do this, but he actually created sister cities with cities in Nicaragua and had exchange programs. He went down himself and, witnessed, the protests and marches of the Sandinistas. And, he was very vocally anti-Contra. And so that's sort of how we know that his anti-imperialist and his anti-interventionist roots go very deep. Throughout the 90s, he would often speak out against war and vote against war measures, but there were a couple of inconsistencies that he voted for bombing Kosovo. And then, of course, like everybody else, he, besides Barbara Lee, he voted in favor of the invasion of Afghanistan. But I think that must have been a turning point for him, where he sort of rediscovered a lot of his old, anti-imperialist roots, anti-interventionist roots shortly thereafter, because from then on out, he's been relatively consistent. He voted against the war in Iraq, and has been extremely consistent and vocal about that for a long time. And then, when it comes to more modern situations, we have, he opposed intervention in Venezuela. He denounced the Bolivia coup as exactly that, a coup. And of course, he led the effort to withdraw U.S. military aid to Saudi Arabia for its war in Yemen. And now not only does he have the strongest statement on the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, but he also, with Ro Khanna, it was just announced mere moments ago that they're going to be introducing something into the House and Senate that will stop Trump from being able to declare war on Iran without congressional approval, which is very similar to the approach that he took with the Yemen conflict. So, yeah, this is a pretty sterling record if you are comparing it to the status quo, which is, of course, everybody from, the far right to what's considered the left, shamefully so, is beating the drums of war at every turn. And Bernie Sanders certainly represents a departure from that. And I do think that if you want an anti-war candidate to go up against Donald Trump, who, by the way, has just indicated that he will be a pro-war candidate, if you want an anti-war candidate against a pro-war candidate, you're going to have to go with Bernie Sanders.
I want an anti-war candidate against a pro-war candidate, and I also want an anti-establishment candidate against an establishment candidate. Which is also Donald Trump. Donald Trump is Mr. 1%. I don't care how much he bloviates. Why is Bernie Sanders uniquely positioned to defeat Donald Trump?
Right. I mean, that's the whole reason that Matt Karp and I wrote this article, which is called Bernie is the Candidate Who Can Beat Trump. Here's why. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's because there's been so much folk wisdom about Bernie Sanders' electability versus Donald Trump. The received wisdom is that if you want to defeat somebody very powerful on the right, you need to pick somebody who's going to draw moderate voters over into the Democratic Party camp. And that means that they are themselves going to have to be more centrist and more moderate. And because everybody knows that Bernie Sanders is neither of those things, there's just a sort of common sense acceptance that he has an electability problem. Of course, the numbers have not borne this out at any point. I mean, he's been crushing Trump in head-to-head polls for years. He crushed him in 2016 in head-to-heads. So, there's no reason for us to believe this, but it's just such a common, it's like, people can't really help that they think this because it is the logical conclusion of the entire sort of political worldview that they've been exposed to, right? Now, the truth of the matter is that the math doesn't really work that way. If you want to defeat Donald Trump, you have to be paying attention to a bunch of different groups that aren't these sort of like reliable, moderate, sort of upper middle class or suburban voters who could go either way, which is what everybody wants to focus on. Instead, you need to focus on the following three groups. And I'm gonna pull this up in the article to make sure that I get all three of them because it's important to do that.
Absolutely. We appreciate it. So research is taking place right now.
I'm researching my own writing right here on the fly. Okay, so for the first group is that you need the Democrats and independents who backed Obama twice before turning to Trump. Right. Now, this is distinct from the imagined group of upper middle class suburban moderates who are reliable voters who could go Democrat or Republican because they are just simply centrists. This is a totally different group. This is a group of people who actually aren't centrists. They're actually attracted to change. And that's what they were attracted to in Barack Obama and in turn, that's what they did not see in Hillary Clinton and were attracted to in Donald Trump. They're sort of ideologically fluctuating, but sort of consistent in their anti-establishment orientation, or, the sort of anti-establishment mood or feeling among them, right? And a lot of them are, like I said, in Rust Belt battlegrounds. And in those counties that flipped from voting for Obama twice and then to Trump, that's 206 counties. Bernie Sanders is out fundraising all of his competitors by a long shot. And yeah, sure, Bernie Sanders is out fundraising his competitors by a long shot everywhere, but he's doing especially well in these counties. And that's really important. I mean, he pulled in almost 82,000 individual donations by September. So this was a while ago, in these flipped counties. And that's roughly 3 times as many as Biden and Buttigieg and Warren, who are sort of clustered down there, very, very, very far behind him in these places. It makes sense. These are the places where, these are working class places that have been hollowed out and abandoned by corporations in search of cheaper labor and higher profits elsewhere. And Bernie Sanders has always been the anti-bad trade deal candidate and the pro-working class candidate. Of course, Donald Trump did a little pantomime of that himself, which was attractive to these people. But this is a much more authentic version of that, right? So I do think it makes a lot of sense that he's got support in these areas, and I think that we'll see that bear out in the primaries. The second group of people that anybody really needs to appeal to if they're going to defeat Donald Trump is Obama voters who declined to vote in 2016. So these are people who voted for Barack Obama and then just didn't show up in 2016. And yeah, turnout was down, 3% in Wisconsin. It was down 4% in Ohio. These are actually really huge numbers. And a lot of people will say, oh, well, that's voter suppression in action. But then you can't really use that. And I'm not going to deny that there's voter suppression. Of course there is in this country, right? But does it explain the outcome of the 2016 election? If it did, then that would be, it would be hard to then explain the fact that 1.7 million people cast incomplete ballots in these states. Or not just these states, but all across the country. So that means that they voted for local offices. They voted for, they voted all the way down to dog catcher. They just left President blank because they were just not interested in what was on offer. And in fact, Pew Research did some polling of non-voters and found that whereas in previous years, they reported that they didn't like the candidates, and that was the main reason why they hadn't voted. That number was hovering at between 8 and 15%. It jumped up to 25 or 27%. I don't know the exact number in 2016 because people just really didn't like either Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama
or Donald Trump. Right.
What did I say? Sorry. Yeah.
Oh no, Donald Trump. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. So we're talking about re-energizing those people who, contrary to what I just said, actually did like Barack Obama. They liked this sort of they were excited and enthusiastic about, a new type of politics. Of course, Obama, if that turned out not to be true in the case of Barack Obama, but they were unlike their, many of their sort of neighbors and peers who switched from Obama to Trump. They were perhaps maybe a little too smart to make that leap. They were we know that Donald Trump's no good either. So they just stayed home. Right. So we need somebody who represents change. And if you look at the Democratic Party presidential primary field, that's Bernie Sanders by a long shot. That's what he represents is, he represents a new type of politics, but he's much more progressive, obviously, than Donald Trump is, right? So he has the chance to appeal to those Obama voters who stayed home. And then, of course, the third group of people is the most important group of people. And that would be people who don't vote at all. And it's actually so ridiculous, as you know, that people, when they talk about elections, they sort of talk about numbers as being limited to, who has turned out in the past. That's the sort of pool that you're drawing from, right? And all of the statistical models are constructed around this and so on. But we have absolutely dismal turnout in this country. 40-something% of people don't vote for president in this country. So in order to figure out how to bring them out, and of course, the ratio of non-voters to voters is so extreme in this country that even just a tiny little bump comparatively in non-voters is going to have a massive, massive impact, right? Or it has the potential to have a massive impact on a general election. So we know that to beat Donald Trump, what we have to do is appeal to non-voters and get them, off their asses and to the polls for in some cases, the first time in their lives. So we need to look at the demographics of these people. So who makes up non-voters in the United States? Of course, it's young people and it's people of color in many cases, and it's more than anything else, it's working class people. Well, Bernie Sanders does the best with young people, people of color, and working class people, right? So, we explain it a bit more in the piece, but essentially, case closed. So those are our reasons for. That's the breakdown of why we think that Bernie Sanders just mathematically and statistically actually has a really good chance of beating Donald Trump and a better chance than anybody else in the field.
That's perfect. I agree 1,000% with each of those assertions. And I think it takes care of a lot of nonsense in the discourse because, again, like some people are really interested in the research that shows that, some of those Obama to Trump voters are people that have definitely been absorbed into they've gone from being sort of vaguely sort of apolitical and kind of liking Obama personally, and now they're almost like they're basically alt-right adjacent Republicans. Yes, some of those people absolutely exist, and guess what? We're not competing for their votes. It's irrelevant. I mean, even if there are 10,000 people concentrated geographically in important places that fit the profile of generally disgusted and interested in an outside candidate, particularly now after 4 years of Donald Trump lying to them, perfect. And then, of course, the other two categories are exactly right. And I think the third point is really important, too, because it's not like a movie where, oh, yeah, what's going to happen is 100 million people who didn't vote before are going to vote or whatever. It's like, no, if you up that a couple of percentage points, that's that's just an absolute result changing thing. So even if that works in a very modest and conservative way, and there's, of course, Sanders is the only campaign with any type of big, broad-based group, mobilization and like an actual movement and energy on the street. Nothing else matches that. I just want to touch on two things really quick before we go. I mean, one is you talked about like the folk wisdom, and I'm wondering is like, what do you think the relationship between people who have heard all of these cliches and they're ready to step out of them versus basically bad faith people who actually clearly don't prioritize beating Trump as much as they claim to want to, who, no matter all the evidence, are just going to keep repeating this stuff again and again and again?
The vast majority of people just kind of they're not political junkies. It's important to remember that people like you and me are extraordinarily rare. And a lot of the bad faith people that you mentioned, who most certainly do exist and totally get under our skin, right? Yeah. On like Twitter or whatever, those people are also extraordinarily rare. They're just really loud. And luckily we're also really loud. So this is the political discourse, right? But most people don't pay attention to us. They pay attention to the news, sort of. And it's just kind of, they've absorbed this by osmosis. But you can actually have conversations with people one-on-one, and people I find are pretty pliable, actually. It's possible to convince them of something that contradicts the folk wisdom that they've sort of absorbed throughout the course of their lifetime. And that's why canvassing is so important. And canvassing is like so daunting, because how could you possibly reach all of those people one-on-one and knock every door? It's kind of scary prospect that we're going to actually get out there and talk to millions, literally millions and millions and millions of people, and reach everybody in time. And we're not going to reach everybody in time. But those are the conversations with the most potential to actually undo some of the, I guess, for lack of a better term, brainwashing, the political brainwashing that people have experienced about what wins and what's electable in this country, right? You have to look people in the face and you have to say, who do you like? And of course, Bernie Sanders has highest favorable. So even people who are not planning to vote for him now will usually say that they like Bernie Sanders. And then you have to say, look, if you are telling me that you like Bernie Sanders, but you want to vote for somebody else because you think that other people don't like Bernie Sanders, is it possible that you are actually representative of an ordinary person? And the reason that Bernie might not be performing in the polls as high as his favorability would suggest is because a lot of people like you are assuming that other people don't like somebody that they do. And you have that conversation with people and it kind of dawns on them. And I think that you can actually change some minds that way.
I agree with you totally, Meagan. I just want to play this for you before before we go. It's 14 seconds from earlier today. It's Bernie Sanders talking about who pays the cost of war, and I think it's a perfect synchronizing of everything we're talking about. So I just want to play this for you before we go. I think this 14 seconds here was really significant.
And I know that it is rarely the children of the billionaire class who face the agony of reckless foreign policy. It is the children of working families.
Meagan, that synchronizes everything, right?
It does, and I also want to say that it's been on my mind, the extent to which Bernie Sanders in this moment, just in the last 24 hours, has really sounded quite a bit like Eugene Debs. I mean, I think some of us a little breathlessly compare him to Debs because in our enthusiasm, right? But truly in the speech in Canton, Ohio, where the socialist leader Eugene Debs made his appeal against World War I, for which he was jailed and then he ran for president from jail, right? He said exactly that. He said, the master class has always declared the wars and the working class has always fought the battles. It's pretty thrilling, and it's very, very unusual also to hear a candidate for president representing a major party in the United States saying words like this in 2020.
I agree with you 1,000%, as I do most always. Meagan Day, everybody, if you're not yet, I can't believe you're not. Read Meagan Day every single week in Jacobin. She's brilliant. She's on point. Meagan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. Always a pleasure.
Take care. All right, folks, here's what we're going to do. We've got to do a gem. Then we're going to take a very brief break. And then Ben Burgess is going to join us. And then right after about 10, 15 minutes of unfiltered Burgess, Lauren Ashcroft is going to join the rest of us. This is a testament of logistical, we're the Quds Force of podcasts. For me, it's kind of,
I mean, it's definitely
just logistically, it's kind of impressive. That's all I'm saying.
We do have an impressive.
That's what I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. Well, you know, when David Griscom of all people is like, "Whoa, geez," maybe I am going too far with a bit.
I don't know. I mean, it's just been.
I don't know, man. Don't say that, man.
It's been a tough 36 hours watching everything that's going on.
It's been a very tough 36 hours.
It's a very good time to be in business if you're in the business of death and destruction, and that was obvious when we saw Northrop Grumman was today's bull of the day, claimed by Yahoo Finance.
Jesus.
But it's not just these defense contractors and like the typical focus of of good progressive ear that benefits from these wars and U.S. bravado and aggression. I really wanted to hit home to people, briefly, but very quickly. The theory of imperialism and why it's so important to American capitalism and how we're not going to break out of that without changing the system. So, the theory of imperialism is something that has been developed over a long time. Lenin was one of the chief architects of the theory. And the simple version of what Lenin argued was that after a period of monopoly capital, right? So within a nation, the different firms have become massive monopolies and a few cartels control all of business. There's no more room left for growth. So the only way to grow is to expand past your borders. And that was what he used as theoretical concept to look at the massive imperialist wars that were happening in the early 20th century. So it was about a reshuffling of the global capitalist order because of the impossibility of infinite growth. Right? There's always going to be a limit to the amount of growth that you can have domestically. And if you're a corporation that's number one goal is growth, you're going to hit that limit sooner or later. So you need these outside forces to come in and redraw the map. Now, of course, there's been a significant amount of changes from the kind of empires of the early 20th century. And the big mistake that people on the left, especially the American left, have made has been actually moving away from the theory of imperialism rather than looking at how it's actually grown and changed. So yes, oftentimes when we think about imperialism, we think about war, but it's very important to remember that that's actually only the second function of imperialism. So war is how you redraw the map. War is how you redraw the power dynamics. But imperialism is really about power, and power is best served when you're not having to send troops in. It's better served when people see institutions that function in a certain way, and they say like, oh, this is just the logic of the world. So imperialism is also when any kind of left-wing government in the developing world comes in and tries to implement some kind of moderate, welfare programs for their people, and the international financial class, which is an imperial entity, prevents them from being able to do that through capital strike, through really harsh punishments, through really disgusting and punitive loans. So that's absolutely something that's crucial when it comes to imperialism. And also we have to remember that imperialism is very much a hegemonic force. So whenever you hear pundits talking about, well, the United States is interested in interacting with this country, or like invading this country, or having military action against this country to restore democracy, to restore stability. Remember, it's not stability in the sense of any kind of safety for the people that are living there. It's stability for the United States financial interests. So we have to see this as a governing force in the way that the United States conducts itself internationally. So, it's not just the wars and invasions, it's also the institutions. And it's definitely shifted dramatically. But globalization did not replace the age of imperialism. Globalization was actually just a high stage of imperialism. So what we see now is a global system where the majority of production changes, where the majority of international finance is controlled by a few corporations. 40% of global revenue goes to just 500 corporations in the world, and a significant amount of the other corporations are very much within the webs of those those top 500 corporations. And, Lenin warned about this as well, saying that, there's a shift that happens in imperialism where it moves from just trying to open up markets for your own goods to actually shifting from the export of goods to the export of capital. And that has been the major shift that we've seen from the United States and from Western Europe over the past 30 to 40 years. So, one, it was a mistake for the United States to abandon the theory of United States leftists to abandon the theory of imperialism, creating these kind of like postmodern ideas of, these kind of like incongruent systems, when it's been very much repeated over and over, especially over the past 20 years, that the United States continues to act like an empire and continues to do that in the long-term interest of capital. It's very important also because people sometimes get lost when they think about imperialism or these forces. In a way, it's not necessarily that a group of, shadowy corporations are sitting in private meetings with the president, though of course that does happen constantly.
Actually happen, yeah.
It's that the state very much understands its role is to look out for the long-term interests of capital. And that's why you start to see these kind of hegemonic discourses that are throughout the bureaucracy, the concepts of like stability. There are people who actually believe these things, but they're constructs for a certain end, and that end is to maintain United States and Western imperialism around the globe. So I bring this up because one, we're not going to be able to get out of this system until we change the system and really start to challenge the fallacy of endless growth. Until we say that we're no longer going to allow the world to be a playground for billionaires and massive corporations to enact destruction across the world so that they can get a larger market share, this is going to continue to happen. So when we see these kind of parallels between what's happening today with Iran and what's happened in 2003 with Iraq, we can't say, why has the media not learned their lesson? Why have the politicians not learned their lesson? Because they're still operating from a paradigm and from a political position that thinks that United States imperial hegemony is a good thing and something that they want to maintain. This will continue until we have the political bravery and the ability to shift this system. So that's why, one, we have to continue to fight against this, any kind of intervention in Iran. We have to revive the anti-war movement as much as possible. And we have to do the political work of fundamentally changing our political system, because here's the fact: the politicians are never going to wake up. We have to change them. And as Americans, we have an extra responsibility to fight and change the system, which has enacted so much destruction around the world.
Absolutely, and we have to run, but I want to just add, there's a really good piece that echoes this in the Global African Worker that I just read, which is a Bill Fletcher Jr. project. And these same, we do need a Green New Deal, and it's very good policy. But if you don't have an internationalist dimension to that, you are going to see that be replicated. So you looking at the coup in Bolivia has something to do with the electric car market, bioprospecting in Africa, in other in parts of the world with more fresh water resources. As long as you have endless growth and unequitable supply chain, even if you green it, those dynamics will be in play. So
and
they're
just
not
really
going
quick,
anywhere.
I just want to suggest one quick reading to people too. Late Imperialism, which is in Monthly Review by John Bellamy Foster. It came out just a couple years ago. It's a really good encapsulation of a lot of the ideas that I was talking about.
Awesome. All right, we're going to take a really brief break, and then we're going to come back with Ben Burgess, and then we're going to have Lauren Ashcroft. Come on, people. TMBS.
Are you familiar with General Soleimani?
Yes. Go ahead. Give me a little. Go ahead. Tell me.
He runs the Quds forces.
Yes. Okay. Right.
Do you expect
and I
his
think the
behavior?
Kurds, by the way, have been horribly mistreated by us.
No, not the Kurds. The Quds forces, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Quds forces, the bad guys.
Right.
Do you expect his behavior to change
I thought
as a
you
result?
said Kurds.
No. Quds.
I'm sorry. I thought you said Kurds.
our president will start a war with Iran because he has absolutely no ability to negotiate. He's weak and he's ineffective. So the only way he figures that he's going to get reelected, and as sure as you're sitting there, is to start a war with Iran. Now, I'm more militant and more militaristic than the president. I believe in strength. But to start a war in order to get elected, and I believe that's going to happen, would be an outrage.
Get your words straight, Jack.
What about the 700 Americans that are dead? Should they not be happy?
Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. We were just fantasizing about how awesome it would be if Donald Trump was Bernie Sanders' press secretary. That was what we were doing off mic. I was just like, everybody knows Jennifer Rubin's pathetic. The only reason the Washington Post... I heard that they keep her there because they feel so bad for her because she's a cat woman. She would live alone with her cats, but they let her write the column. So, you know, she's going to keep attacking Bernie Sanders, but it's because she's pathetic. By the way, that was an example of the Trump impersonation. People always ask me, like, how much of the impersonation is you? 100% me on that one.
Nice.
Ben Burgess, welcome to the show. You finally in studio. The great Ben Burgess has returned. He's our weekly debunk guest. He's the author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. He teaches logic, as Jesse Lee Peterson would say, and rhetoric at Perimeter State College, Georgia State University. And he's also the proprietor of a great Patreon page. Ben, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, the consummate enthusiasm that you always bring to your introduction, Ben.
Sorry, I was still hung up.
Yeah, I think it's time for your song.
Wow.
You're going to be, I was going to riff with you for a minute, but forget it. Let's just get right to the song.
All right. I was still thinking about Trump and Jennifer Rubin, but, you know.
Well, look, you go right back to it. Maybe the song will get you in the mode. Because Frank wanted a little bit low energy.
I will.
Let's go. Please go.
Okay.
You got to restrain me. Debunk all of it. Logical analysis. You're going to show us how to argue that. Go.
This is based on data from a bunch of different countries. There's abundant evidence that at this point that's bullshit. Breaking down these right-wing arguments and looking at how they're supposed to fit together.
Okay, break it down. Break it down. Break it down. Thank you, Moondog. Kind of sounds like most of the conversations we have on and off air.
More or less.
Donald Trump, Jennifer Rubin, thoughts?
Yeah. So Jennifer Rubin, that's the New York Post?
No, she's at the Washington Post.
Okay.
She's one of these people who, like, you know, has spent all of her career. She
knows a lot of editors, basically.
She knows a lot of editors. She loves Mitt Romney. And then, you know, one of these, you know, obviously Donald Trump is so uncouth, so I'm anybody but Trump. But it has like a pathological hatred of Bernie Sanders, which I'm going to psychobabble here a little bit. I'm going to attribute some of it to Jewish self-hatred. Because I cannot, I'm sorry. I can't keep, like, if you're a billionaire, it makes sense why you don't like Bernie Sanders. And then and I'm not saying like you don't have to vote for him, but like to actually hate Bernie Sanders, you're suspect, as they would say in Good Will Hunting. It's just weird. So Jennifer Rubin's like, yeah, but she's like one of these neocons who's just like, oh my God, Donald Trump has Twitter, you know, but then like really doesn't like Bernie Sanders. So I would like to see Donald Trump dunk on her on behalf of a Sanders administration. That could be the way. It could be part of his community service when he goes to jail after Bernie beats him.
Yeah, I mean, I do always appreciate the way that like leftists are much more honest than liberals about the fact that everybody enjoys watching Donald Trump make fun of people.
Right. Well, and it also makes us the big thing that's happening right now that I find really disturbing, and it doesn't surprise me, but it's like I keep saying this because I have to ease people into it. It's like I think you need to beat Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. I do not recant my Hillary Clinton, who I will put my sincere contempt for her against anybody's. And I happen to not like her for like the right reasons. You should have voted for her over Trump if you were in a swing state. I do not revert. Like, that's the same position I have. And I don't consider that to be vote shaming or whatever.
Is that a term, vote shaming?
Yeah, I've heard this.
Sorry, that's a new one to me.
How's that? Does that fit the test of logic? But I would say that I'd be accused of fallacy shaming. Oh, can we play a song again? So but like, you need to beat Donald Trump, 100%. And I
really want to know what the limits of that are. Like, is it just like, is there a piece of piece of garbage shaming? Like, I'm a piece of garbage, but I don't want to be shamed for it.
I don't know, but I just think like watching liberals, they are so consumed with hatred about Trump, but then some of them will actually say, and hopefully it's not, they'll try to destroy Sanders, who every day just looks more like, no, this is really the person that is most equipped to beat this guy. Yeah. And then secondly, because they're so freaked out and they hate him so much, they have no analytic or strategic capacity to actually understand what he does effectively, which honestly, like, not to like over intellectualize the fact that we're all, just like a bunch of like stupid guys who like Trump because we like shock jock humor. But honestly, like, no, you really should have some understanding of like what your opponent is doing. And all day it's like, can you believe? And it's just like, yeah, I can. First of all, last thing I'll say, yes, I can believe. When are we going to let go of like, can you believe Trump said X? Like, yes.
Yes.
My
entire experience of watching Trump on television is him saying things like that. So yeah, I can believe it. But that is at least it's a very charitable interpretation that like Trump has just broken them. They just can't think about it, because otherwise I do get really confused, right? Like, especially back, like, this has receded a little bit, but especially back when all these people were pretending to think that like there was no policy differences between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Then it just seemed like, all right, I mean, at the risk of terrible reason and shaming them, then like, I would just think like, so if there are no policy differences and we have 4 years of polls showing that Bernie would beat Trump, then wouldn't you support him?
Right. No, it's whatever the nexus point of like a complete inability to assess Trump as part of actually beating him, not just complaining about him incessantly, and like weird pathological hatred of like a nice old man who's fighting through a heart attack to give you health care. Whatever that nexus is a very bizarre, like, look at this 78-year-old flying across the country to eliminate my student debt. What an asshole. I hate that guy.
I think some of it is that like really their biggest objection to Trump isn't the racism. It's not the genuinely monstrous policies. It's the disruption of the status quo. It's that we could be at brunch right now.
Right.
And if Trump is beaten by Bernie Sanders, then, and if you admit that that's the best strategy for beating Trump, then you're kind of admitting that there's no going back to the pre-Trump status quo. Whereas, hey, even if he's impeached or if he just resigns in shame, like I think they kind of think he'll do, right? That like that illusion never quite goes away. Even
like good faith Republicans.
Yeah. That like if some Republican saves us from him, like, Daddy Mueller or whatever before before that fizzled out.
Right.
You know, even if Mike Pence becomes president, that's okay because we can go back to brunch because the system works.
Right. Well, Mike Pence isn't like, you know, I don't know, like terrorizing a kid in a wheelchair on Twitter. So that's, I can like, well, and what was incredible is I won't even play this because it was despicable, and we're going to see a lot more of it as he gears up for re-election. But there was that Trump thing where he told that really sick fairy tale at his crowds about the snake, and that was his the snake represented immigrants and Muslims, and he's just like, you know, you let me in and I bit you, but you should have known, said the snake. Blah. And what's really twisted about it is I've had conversations with liberals while they're talking about like, well, what if Paul Ryan would, you know, or what? That was one. And I got to a point where I was like, you know, the only thing that fits now is I want to give you the Trump talk. Where it's just like the Republicans are a snake. They're here to win. It's an incredible moment when you have a genuine authoritarian politics on the march, and then a weird centrist, whatever, liberal response, which is caught in between a complete freak out, which precludes any analytic ability, combined with like actually a real fundamental lack of seriousness about actually beating it. It's I mean, that is, and I was wrong. I honestly thought some of that would fizzle out. I thought more of some of these folks. But,
I mean, I think they've gotten serious because it's not like it's not like liberals are still supporting like some joke candidate like the mayor of the fourth largest city in Indiana, you know, like who really could not win state election in Indiana, you know, and like trying to put him against Donald Trump. No, they're not doing that. And it's also not like in addition to endlessly looking for candidates that would absolutely lose to Trump, that they aren't saying like with one, you know, in the beginning of the day, Donald Trump is a without peer existential threat, and then at the end of the day, re-upping the Patriot Act, giving him the Space Force, saying that the problem with assassinating potentially the second most powerful politician in Iran is that there wasn't a tidy press release with it, and incidentally, what's wrong with Iran? War with Iran anyway. All, of course, while saying like Donald Trump is the worst thing ever, besides his attempt to have a coup in Venezuela. Right.
You know, I mean, it's genuinely astonishing. But let's take a few minutes. We'll keep talking about this, but we have to bring Lauren on actually, and I'll make her. But let's do a few minutes before we bring Lauren on of rhetoric, because this does matter a lot. The two thoughts behind this I'm going to throw right to you are one, what is the relationship between the rise of the PR industry and the rise of Trump, and like having a conversation about propaganda and influence that is a global one, not just some kind of hyperventilating about Russian Facebook ads. And also, you know, obviously we're in a moment where, you know, we're going back to the lies and propaganda before the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. This is important stuff for us to think about. And you literally teach logic and rhetoric.
Yeah, well, I teach logic classes. I've taught, you know, composition classes and things before. We've talked about rhetoric. And I talk quite a bit about it in the chapter that I wrote for a book that's coming out next year, which is called Myth and Mayhem, a leftist response to Jordan Peterson. And I co-wrote that with Matt McManus, Marion Trejo, Conrad Hamilton, and there's also an introduction by Slavoj Žižek.
Nice.
Yes.
That's a big score. Awesome.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's good stuff. So my chapter about this was about Jordan Peterson, Christopher Hitchens, and the perils of good rhetoric. And so this is something that actually you and I have been talking about for a long time, going back to when I first met you at that Jordan Peterson conference in Boise, because sometimes when you're critiquing like the argument, you know, you're sort of trying to critique Jordan Peterson on the level of arguments, it feels like you're missing the point, because
Totally missing the point.
He's just sort of, like if he says he had a vision and a dream, what are you going to say? Like, no, have better dreams, like that's,
Actually, yes, that's literally what I would say to Jordan Peterson. Have better dreams.
Yeah, fair enough.
Be less of an asshole. I actually like that.
Yeah. But part of the reason that he can say things like there's a clip, not the one we're going to watch, but there's like an infamous clip where he's showing his students some like entwined snake imagery from ancient artwork, and he's saying, it's it's complicated to explain, but I think this is actually literally a depiction of the DNA double helix, that was discovered in the mid 20th century. And you watch that, it's astonishing because there's a room full of adults and nobody starts laughing when he says that. Right? And the reason is that whatever else is true about Jordan Peterson, he actually is a incredibly compelling speaker. And I think we have just a brief clip of him to illustrate that.
They don't believe that there's a Canadian identity. They don't believe that there's an American identity. They don't believe that there's a Western identity. They don't believe that value structures exist, or if they are, they're irreplaceable with some other value structure. They certainly don't believe that they have any biological grounding, that there's any such thing as a human being. It's all socially constructed, which is really convenient if what you want to do is be the author of an entirely social constructed utopia that you can run. And then when the Marxists say, well, that wasn't real Marxism, what it really means, and I've thought about this for a long time, it's the most arrogant possible statement anyone could ever make. It means, if I would have been in Stalin's position, I would have ushered in the damn utopia instead of the genocidal massacres, because I understand the doctrine of Marxism and everything about me is good. It's like, well, think again, sunshine. You don't understand it. You don't understand it. And you're not that good.
Well, I have a big problem right there, because I've had a dream where I have Stalin-like power, and I do usher in a utopia.
Nice.
So screw you, Jordan Peterson. You don't know my dreamscape.
No, fair enough.
Yeah. How dare you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there's a lot obviously going on in that clip. He's doing the usual thing that he does where he wildly conflates Marxism and postmodernism, which are very different schools of thought. Right. And we've talked about that stuff before. And if you want my debunk of that particular argument, that's in the book. But what interests me more right now is why it sells so well.
Right.
So Jordan Peterson is, a best-selling author. He has, when he debated Slavoj Žižek, tickets to that in Toronto were going more than you could sell Maple Leaf tickets for, as a scalper.
Jesus.
That's
disturbing.
It is disturbing, right?
Yeah.
I have spent a lot of time in college bookstores, and they've all got copies of 12 Rules for Life. And, along with the anodyne self-help advice, most of which is fine, he's got all the kind of stuff that's in there, right?
Right.
So a lot of people are buying what he's selling. Why is that? And trying to think about that made me think of somebody I like about 1 million times more than I like Jordan Peterson, even though obviously I have deep disagreements with a lot of his late-in-life political positions, who's Christopher Hitchens. So Hitchens, in the last years of his life, was the subject of all of these YouTube compilation videos that people had put together, that of his sort of, rhetorical power chords, that they'd called, these are his Hitch slaps.
Right.
And so we've also got a clip of a few of the Hitch slaps.
Well, I asked her about, because she wasn't content just to say religious people volunteer for charity, as if that was news to anybody, but she had to couple it with a smear against Fabianism and social democracy. Now, as a matter of fact,
well, they weren't there, Christopher. That's all I was saying.
I'm so sorry to say that without
the
efforts of Fabianism...
But you're good at smears.
The efforts of Fabianism...
What's wrong with the smear?
I don't... I'll get to the end of this sentence if it kills you.
I, for one, will take it as extremely insulting if any person of faith makes the assumption that their faith gives them a moral edge on me. I want to hear a lot more apologizing from the faith-based communities for the evil that they've done before they even start clearing their throats and telling me I wouldn't know right from wrong without their permission. I'm sorry, I can't be spoken to in that tone of voice, and nor should any of you.
So what if God actually exists, sir? Would he not have been good to you?
No.
He wouldn't, because if that were true, it would mean that I had an eternal supervising parent who would never die and let me get on with my life, never let me grow up, would keep me under surveillance.
But you have, sir.
And supervision every minute of my life,
but
and constantly asked me to be thanking and praising him.
Yeah,
I think it would be
wasn't part of the scenario.
like living in North Korea. I think it would be a horrible outcome.
Well, not sure that God is Kim Jong-il, but what if what I said is true?
Well, ask Kim Jong-il, he has a different opinion.
Okay, well, those were fun.
Yeah, those
even as exhausted as I am by atheism, those were very fun. I agree with those. Mostly.
Yeah, no, those were very fun. But it's also interesting to kind of take a step back here because, if you read, a lot of what Hitchens wrote over the course of his life, I have, I know Griscom has, that. He does have a lot of like really smart and insightful things to say about a lot of subjects. But I think you've got to admit that in the last, 10 years or so of his life, which is when all these hitch slap videos were made, that was, political judgments aside, right? It's not just that I disagree with him, right? That, although God knows I do, but it's that's where he had the least interesting things to say of any phase of his career.
We're in the precursors of the global financial meltdown. We have a global war on terrorism generating a new hegemonic model across Asia, Africa, the Middle East. And this guy is spending the better bulk of his time using a brilliant intellect and witty presentation to dunk on people for believing in fairy tales.
Yes.
I'm
sorry, that's sad.
I recently re-listened to arguably his collection of essays. It's on Audible, at least. And there's it seems, maybe I'm misremembering, but there's 4 different burqa essays.
Oh, yeah.
And
I'm obsessed with this nonsense. So what explains
totally
it? So
right.
What happens?
Yeah, so, yeah, absolutely. And just to pile onto your point, Hitchens is from the UK, Brexit happened, not that long after he died. Which was part of the reason it happened was because the political failures of David Cameron. There was a line where Hitchens was asked what he thought about Cameron, and his response was, "He doesn't make me think," which is funny.
It's
right?
funny, yeah, but also very stupid.
Also super unhelpful, right?
Right.
That's not that's it, right?
Right?
So what he was devoting himself at this point to was the most simplistic possible form of jingoistic warmongering, that because Saddam Hussein is bad and evil, and because, the terrorists are bad and evil, then, rah-rah.
Rah-rah.
And on the other hand, I say this as an atheist, but an incredibly reductive and uninteresting version of anti-theism where you just sort of turn this abstraction of religion into this bogeyman that explains everything. Literally the subtitle of one of his last books, religion poisons everything, right? So it's not, whatever people are responding to here, it's not the analytic rigor. He was capable of bringing analytic rigor, but that's not what's going on in these videos.
Right.
And so what is going on? Well, part of it, he's got a great sense of humor, of course, right? That never left him. His writing never left him. Part of it is just, both in the writing and in the speaking, incredibly good rhetorical packaging. And that's not a bad thing, right? We don't want to demonize that. When we talk about these PR firms that you're bringing up, we certainly want to train people to see through what they're doing, but we don't want to be purists about we don't care about how we rhetorically package our arguments, because of course, if we care about winning, we absolutely have to care about how we package our arguments rhetorically. But it's important to teach people how to see through it. Right? One of the things I talk about in the book is the Christopher Hitchens effect, which has a lot to do with just the fact that he has, in Hitchens' case, an accent that Americans are trained culturally to associate with intelligence and insight.
Yep.
And even more generally, just the fact that he had an accent, that he had speech patterns that ring slightly unusually to us. And this is actually exactly one of the reasons that Jordan Peterson has been so successful in finding an American audience, because as different as his kind of, rural Canadian backwater background is from, Christopher Hitchens's, posh and boozy, speech patterns, the effect of somebody who, this is like a traveler from afar who speaks in an unusual way to me, right, to us, and they just know stuff I don't. Right, like when Jordan Peterson, the first clip we watched, said, "I've spent a lot of time thinking about this," right? Which I
sure
think better, but but this is an effect that if you're, it's easy to get lulled into, but. I guess maybe we could just wrap up on this point, right? That if you don't learn to like take a step back and recognize that you're being ensnared in this, then you're going to fall for some truly ridiculous charlatans. So one obvious example. So Bill Maher, who is, friend of late Christopher Hitchens, had him on his show numerous times, praised him, etc. When Milo Yiannopoulos was on Bill Maher's show, Maher, as much as he would like to revise this bit of history, said, "You remind me of a young Christopher Hitchens." And think, what is it that reminds you about Christopher Hitchens? I mean, I don't think Milo has ever had a thought more complicated than feminists are ugly or I like black dick, right? I mean, literally those are the thoughts that he expresses. But he's got that private school British accent, and he's got some of the cocky self-confidence, and a little bit of a sense of humor, not very much.
He's no Hitchens, and all he's doing is, and I think the other thing, just the final thing too, is that then it also just reconstitutes. Like Christopher Hitchens is just giving you George W. Bush with a posh accent. Jordan Peterson is just giving you, transphobia and hystericizing about socialism and whatever else with a kind of, that sort of off the beaten path kind of flavor. So I think that's the other piece. And of course, I mean, Milo just, I can't even put him in that category, but just like the reconstituting of conventional wisdom that seems to be packaged differently. But we have to bring up, Lauren Ashcroft is here. She's coming. Are you ready? Yeah. Oh, you're going to be right here. Okay. Lauren Ashcroft, I'm sorry, we could have taken a break, but I think it would be better if you just come this way. Or that's fine. Lauren Ashcroft.
Hey.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. So excited.
You are running for Congress.
Yes.
In New York's 12th district.
Yes, that is correct.
Who are you running against and why?
I'm running against Carolyn Maloney. And I have a vision for my district that includes every single person having full and equal representation. And my family is an example of what happens when that doesn't happen. So my grandfather died because of corporate greed in a coal mine. My grandmother was an immigrant from Japan who was treated with extreme xenophobia and racism. My other grandfather fell while he was working and became a quadriplegic. So I saw firsthand what it's like for people with disabilities to go completely ignored. And whenever we look at District 12, a lot of people think about the fact that, yes, it does have a lot of billionaires and $200 million condominiums, but it also has thousands of people dying on the street because they're homeless. And it has people that are rationing their insulin because they can't afford it. And I've seen that working class people and everyday people have gone ignored in my district, just like my family has. And I am standing up for that full and equal representation for every single person.
Awesome.
Thank you.
And I just want to say, I mean, I've done some events with Lauren. I totally believe in this effort. And, we try to have some people on who are running. We can't actually always do it because we do and we will, but it's not really in some ways, it's not really on format for the show. But it also obviously is important because a lot of people like you who bring totally different life experience and really exceptional commitment to genuine politics are taking on this risk. And I guess, we'll get back to your opponent in a second, but where would you fit yourself politically? Like, who do you support for president? What are your politics? How do you describe yourself?
I'm a Democratic Socialist, and I support Bernie Sanders for president very, very strongly.
Yes.
So I am running to support his platform, and I see him as the solution to the fact that we've been meeting these really, really urgent problems with super incrementalism style politics at best. Right now, we're going way backwards very quickly. And we need somebody who's going to take us all the way forwards to save life on our planet, for example, which is pretty important.
Should be nice.
I would say so. I would say that there's a certain, do you have actually, I promise on Tuesday, actually, there's a big, we're going to spend a lot of time on the crisis in Australia on Tuesday, but just seeing that, and even just like, and I'd recommend What Do You Mean's videos, really good. But just like the amount of wildlife that have died, if you take a beat to absorb that, it's devastating on every possible level. And the last I heard, the Prime Minister of Australia was still going to go on a trade mission to India, which is based on coal exports, which, Australia is very synchronized with the Trump, Bolsonaro, Orban world, Netanyahu world. But, when you see what's happening in Australia and you think of your position in politics and your leadership, what do you, I guess both foreign and domestically, what do you think in terms of that?
It's terrifying. And I agree with Bernie Sanders in what he said the other day, that this kind of disaster is just going to keep happening more and more frequently as we go along and we don't address the problems in the way that we should. So I do support a Green New Deal, but going further, I support banning single-use plastics. I also support incentivizing everyone using public transit as their method of transportation. Yes. So I am pushing for nationalizing our public transit nationwide, making it free, and also upgrading it so it is efficient and gets people where they need to go. That's awesome. Yeah, that needs to go hand in hand with the Green New Deal, because it doesn't help that we have people depending on cars to get where they need to go. And right now, our public transit system in New York City is not accessible to people with disabilities, which matters a lot to me and my platform. And whenever I think about the fact that we're excluding so many people from our public transit, it's disturbing. And also, we're not helping people to get out of the life situations and elevate themselves. So I know that Bernie Sanders is somebody that fights for equality of everyone and fights for people to be able to elevate themselves. And I agree with that and want to provide, first of all, a way for people to get to work and get to where they need to go, no questions asked, no fares. And I also want to incentivize people using the greenest method of transportation possible.
So I haven't heard people. I've compared who you're running against to Joe Crowley. Fair comparison?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and I know there are a lot of self-proclaimed progressives in Congress right now, and my opponent is one of them, in my opinion. Whenever you continuously endorse people who are not embodying progressive values, for example, she did not endorse AOC. Right. She did not endorse Tiffany Caban, for example. Right. And today I was just protesting Melinda Katz not keeping her campaign promise and ending cash bail. So it is really important that whenever you call yourself a progressive, you're connecting and partnering with progressives at all levels of government, and also supporting a network of people that are trying to do the right thing for the agenda that you supposedly represent.
Right, absolutely. What would your response be to the assassination of the General Soleimani and Iran and foreign policy in the Middle East more generally?
I'm terrified right now, first of all. I have studied international relations. That's my bachelor's degree. And the more that I learned from my studies, the more that I saw that we have intervened in horrible ways that have destabilized entire regions that are still suffering because of us. And so I am against American imperialism as it is. But what we're seeing right now with what's going on with Iran is that we have granted Donald Trump and also Barack Obama and George Bush the unilateral power they needed to bypass Congress's approval and do what they see as fit, which might not be a problem with some presidents, but it certainly is a problem when you give that kind of power to Donald Trump. And Barbara Lee was the only person that voted against that.
We're going to be playing some of that in the postgame, actually, later on, of Barbara Lee's initial unbelievably courageous opposition to that. I can only imagine the personal security consequences of voting against authorization weeks after September 11th. Ben, do you have any questions for the next Congresswoman from the 12th?
Yeah. So you had a stand-up comedy night a while back as a fundraiser.
That's right.
Just wondering if there was going to be a video of that online at some point.
Oh, yes. There are clips of it online that I've posted on Twitter, but I have to post them more often, I think. But there's also going to be another comedy show coming up, so if anyone's watching and lives in New York and wants to come, follow me at Vote Ashcraft.
Is there anything else? Because you're going to spend a little bit of time in the postgame with us where we are actually going to play an incredible clip from Joe Biden. I actually see, the more Joe Biden campaigns, the more I actually really believe in him. Because I think on a subconscious level, he is telling us, don't do this. Vote for Bernie Sanders if you want to beat Donald Trump. just even like Elizabeth Warren. Like I just noticed Elizabeth Warren just came out for the new NAFTA. Yeah. And I'm just like, I think in Biden's case, it's his melt brain subconsciously signaling, and I think it's Warren's like endless overthinking, that are both signaling us like, this is not a good idea if you want to actually beat Trump.
So actually, I do have a maybe even more substantive question.
Okay, if you have a substantive question, because I was gonna have her give a solid pitch. If you have anything else that doesn't involve video of you doing stand-up, that'd be great. Yes.
No. So I could see somebody like, maybe in your district, and if they don't, if they're not like hyper political, and so they're just like looking into the stuff a little bit. And as you say, right, your opponent's a self-described, progressive, and so they could do a Google search, and like maybe like most of what they find would kind of look okay, right? And from my perspective, the sort of reason to support a candidate like you anyway, I mean, or besides, like, I'm sure we could find other problems with your opponent and everything, but the sort of big picture thing is that, like, if we talk about the kinds of things you're talking about, and some of which maybe, right, your opponent is on paper on board with, right, Medicare for all, for example, right, then accomplishing that, much less the Green New Deal and all these other things, involves taking on like tremendous vested interests and like just having a level of like grassroots political mobilization that like we haven't really seen in this country in like 50 years, if any, if ever, right? And so like the way that I would think of it is, okay, well, given that, no matter how okay they might seem on paper, I think if they're not like a really solid like Bernie-crat, right, then I don't really trust them to hold firm against those interests when push comes to shove. But I guess I'm not sure what the sort of pithy way to say that would be convincing to somebody who isn't like a political junkie is.
Yeah. So I also, on paper, she might look okay, but whenever you dig deeper, it's truly not. So whenever we're talking about what's going on in Iran right now, it is very scary that she has accepted defense contractor money as her campaign contributions. It's scary that she did vote to approve the AUMF that's allowing this kind of terrorism to exist and happen at the hands of our president. And it's very scary that she voted for the war in Iraq, which set precedent and killed hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians and also cost American life as well. Right. And it's scary that she also voted for the increase in military budget that is funding this kind of act. So on paper, I actually don't think that she looks very good. And definitely not whenever you dig into her campaign contributions, you'll see what I like to consider a lot of the logic behind some of the decisions that she's making.
Yeah, and when people are faced with a conflict between what they said they do and what their donors want them to do, it's usually not surprising how they come down.
Yes, exactly. So I am running a 100% people-powered and grassroots campaign, which is really important. Rule number one, if you are a progressive, I think you need to reject corporate PAC money and defense contractor money and big pharmaceutical company money and real estate money. All of that kind of dirty money, you cannot accept it and say you're supporting the agenda that we're fighting for.
Absolutely. So you're going to spend some time with us in the post game. But before we go to the post game, please tell everybody all the different ways they can get involved and help make this happen. This is really important.
Yes.
We need this upgrade. This is profoundly important. There needs to be huge grassroots mobilization, and there needs, like, it's awesome. We see Ilhan Omar, we see AOC, we see some of the things Rokan is doing, we see some of the things, obviously someone like Barbara Lee or Mark Pocan, but they even writ large, from the one you like most to the one you like least, anybody that on any kind of progressive wing in Congress is absolutely in the minority of the minority. Look at this new military appropriation. Huge amount of Democrats voted to give Trump a blank check, massive increase, his Space Force. They're re-upping the Patriot Act. And then, of course, they vote for the concentration camps at the border and all the rest of it. And you know that they will be front and center fighting. They already are against everybody having health care, not to mention the whole next generation of profoundly important, like free universal transit. So we need leaders like Lauren in
Squad
Congress.
season 2.
Yes. Yes. So, Lauren, how can they help you make it happen?
So I am at laurenashcraft.com. So definitely go there. That's how you can fill out a form and volunteer with the campaign. And also there's a donate button that you can be one of our grassroots donors. And our average contribution right now, I believe, is $25.
Awesome.
So we are super grassroots funded, and every single donation matters a lot because it takes money to fight big money and to fight corporate PAC-backed politicians like my opponent. So you can also find me on social media at Vote Ashcraft, where I will be posting about some upcoming comedy shows that I hope you both are at.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And follow Matt back.
Oh.
Yeah, just
yeah.
Come on, Lauren.
I'm so sorry.
I'm just kidding. So, no, it's really great, and I'm really looking forward to actually doing this Joe Biden clip with you in the post game and spending a little bit more time with us in the post game. And Lauren's actually funny.
Thank you.
I say that as somebody who really does not think like I'm.
Michael likes to monopolize that adjective.
Whether or not you agree that I'm funny, I think that I'm funny, and I don't chip that out for many people. I think Eddie Murphy's funny. I think I'm funny. I think Howard Stern in his heyday was extremely funny, and Bill Burr. I don't know, and Lauren.
Nice.
Pretty much it.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Nice short list.
Yeah.
Before we end, if I could do a 10-second plug, because somebody's gonna be very mad at me if I don't do it.
Yes, go do your plug.
The book that I talked about earlier, we have a website for it, which the URL is drjordanpeter.ca. Very proud to nab that. But in any case, but people who are interested in being part of the fun and writing essays, they have things to say that are, critiques of Peterson from the left. Greg Talon is the guy who does the website for us, is looking for those to put on the website. So, it's they're looking for in-depth writing, not stuff you'd say to dunk on him on Twitter, but do check out the website and do please submit essays.
I'm going to submit like 1 million sound files of me doing an annoying impression of him.
Can we have a taste?
Sorry.
It's like, so actually what you see here is a double helix. Which,
I want to somehow make Nation of Islam Obama in relation to it. It's like, Jesus Christ, white people are really, they're hurting. This guy's acting like some type of 1950s housewife. He's a masculinity guru. Out of your fucking minds. Yeah, nominate Pete Buttigieg. Really smart. Become a member of the Michael Brooks Show. It's really important. That's how everything happens. Patreon.com/TMBS. We're well on our way to, we want to, obviously hit 4,000 patrons soon. For Comrade and Above patrons, we just released our latest documentary with Vic Fayana, which is on the history of the RAND Corporation and how it fed, national security state, the idea of meritocracy in both actually good ways and extremely destructive ways, also conspiracy theory culture. Go to tmbs.fm, get gear, and of course we're going to be selling gear and hoodies and shirts at live shows. And the next one is at the Bell House, February 7th in Brooklyn. Grab your tickets. Ben is going to be there. Alona Minkowski is going to be there. Pretty Bad Lefty, Chad Vigorous, Brendan Sutton's going to be there. And also Professor Harvey K. And for some real throwback, Matt Binder. And obviously all of us. Now, I will just say we're over halfway sold out on that one. So if this goes the same trajectory as Philly was sold out well in advance. So I don't know, but I would do it quickly because you certainly don't want to be going to see if there's extra tickets there. So grab your tickets. See you in the post game. Thanks, everybody.